What's the difference between your 911, your CAD data, and your records management system data, your RMS data, and why you should never, ever get rid of either? This is Dawn Reedy from Excellence in Analytics, and today we are walking through the different types of data that analysts need access to and when to use which one. So we're going to talk about CAD data, that 911 call data, when it's valuable, what to keep, what to delete. We're going to also talk about RMS data, records management data, and that could be things like your crimes, your police info, your crashes, and such. So we're going to walk through exactly when to use which data set to analyze what. Far too often, I will work with an agency and they'll say, okay, well, our data is dirty, so we're just not going to analyze it. Stop in your tracks. You still need access to that data. And other agencies will say, well, you know what? We don't really analyze our CAD data. It's not really important. We only analyze our crime data. No, no, no. Your CAD data provides such value to you and your police agency in its data-driven efforts. And I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. All right, so first, what is CAD data? CAD stands for calls for service data, right? So calls for service data, CAD system, a computer aided dispatch. That's the official CAD, stands for computer aided dispatch. This is when someone calls 911. So someone calls 911, it hits a regional, right? A large group, or it hits the local police department. Either way, someone calls 911, they have an emergency. And it's really important to know if somebody is reporting what they think is an emergency, right? So someone could report shots fired, and then it turned out to be, the cat knocks over the garbage can. And we're going to talk about why both of those pieces of data are so important. So computer-aided dispatch is primarily what is intended to direct police to responding to an emergency. Right. And so it's not going to be perfect. Your CAD data, your 911 data is not going to be perfect, and you should not change it. Right. So when an officer goes to a call for, let's say, gunshots fired, and then he shows up or she shows up and it's the cat knocked over the garbage can, we don't go back and change that. And here's why. Because we want to know the type of calls that our officers are responding to. What are our priority one calls? Where are we spending our time? Where are we spending our energy? The crux of data-driven strategies is using information to drive decisions. So if we only know what was real, right, like what turned into a crime, and not things like that cat knocking over the garbage can, then we really won't fully assess where all of our officers spend our time. So computer-aided dispatch calls, or those 911 calls, will come into a regional center or into the local center. Sometimes smaller communities will use a regional center because they don't have enough calls for service. And so it'll come from a regional center who then distributes it to those smaller districts. So the call comes in, and let's talk about some examples of CAD calls. So a call could come in, it could be shots fired, it could be a neighborhood issue, a medical emergency. So dispatch really, they're the folks taking these calls, and they need to be able to distinguish, am I sending an ambulance? Am I sending a police officer? Am I sending the fire department? Who am I sending? Where am I pushing this information? So all of that is critical to collect and identify and understand our emergencies, those things that our officers are responding to, whether or not they turn out to be that emergency, right? So sometimes a CAD call can be generated if someone walks into the police department. We had someone the other day walk into the police department and they say, hey, my bank account was, hit. Someone took $500. Even though the bank reimbursed them, they still needed to report that this fraud occurred, right? So they may walk into a police agency. Another way that a CAD call happens is an officer initiates that call, right? So maybe it's a motor vehicle stop. They see someone like me, I got pulled over. They see someone who's not doing the right thing, or maybe they have an expired license or an expired tag, a registration or whatever, and they're pulling over a vehicle. They're initiating a motor vehicle stop. So that's a proactive way, in a sense, to have a CAD call. So there's reactive CAD calls. Someone calls 911 or walks into a police agency, And then there's proactive CAD calls where the officer initiates some activity. They're stopping a motor vehicle. Maybe they're going to a business and doing a business check to make sure that everything's all right. Maybe they're doing some proactive engagement. Maybe they're, playing with kids in a park to get to know them better. Or if they have some community policing efforts, they're doing things like that are engagement activities. And we're documenting all of these engagement activities in CAD calls. Sometimes our CAD calls also include administrative tasks, such as paperwork or follow-up activities. Some agencies record their sex offender registries in CAD calls. And maybe you're assisting another agency. So maybe the crime did not occur in your agency. Maybe state police have control of it or another community, but you still are assisting, right? Maybe the FBI, when there was the Boston bombings, our folks from Nashua, New Hampshire, and from all over New Hampshire and Massachusetts and other areas all went down to Boston to find the suspect for the Boston for the bombings that were happening down there, right? And so you could be assisting another agency. We still want to record that information. So those are some examples of CAD calls. So you got to remember, calls for service, CAD calls, they include that initial response. So whenever you want to study, analyze, research, the initial response, where our operations lie, what are we doing in policing, what are we responding to, what are our officers facing day in and day out. We want anything related to the initial response, regardless of the outcome. We're going to use our CAD data to analyze that, right? So the analyst really needs to access the data in incident level form. So when someone calls 911, the dispatch will have multiple screens, and one of them will pop up and be like an interface where someone can type in what's happening, right? So it'll say the address, the location, type, and so forth. But the analyst doesn't want that interface. The analyst wants to grab all of the CAD data from the back end so that it's in some sort of spreadsheet, right? Some sort of spreadsheet that they can sort and they can analyze. And this really allows us as analysts to sift through manually, and we can set up some processes to analyze, and look at increases and decreases. Are we having more proactive activity, more reactive activity? And we can really aggregate any way that we want to analyze. There's a couple of key critical elements of CAD calls, data elements of CAD calls. So if you're transitioning CAD systems, you got to know what CAD call elements are important. So every CAD call will have a call number, right? Something unique that identifies that particular call. Now, if I call 911 and my neighbor calls 911 and my other neighbor calls 911, all on one individual, those will all be different CAD calls, even though they're relating to the same crime. So the dates and time represent exactly when the activity was called in. So if someone calls 911, we want to know the call date and the call time. That helps us with deploying our officers. That helps us with staffing. That helps us with so many things. So we don't want to ignore our CAD data. Reason code, why we went out there in the first place. The action code, what happened? Was someone arrested? Did we clear without incident? What happened at this particular location, right? The priority, was it a priority 1, priority 2? Priority 1 is important, right? Really, really critical. Timing is of the essence. This would be like a burglary in progress or a robbery in progress, right? We want the address, the street apartment number. We want the city. If you're a regional system, we want the jurisdiction that it's in, right? We want any intersecting street locations. We want the location. So if it's 123 Main Street, is it a bank? Is it a school? So all of these key data elements will be in your CAD system. Sometimes the cities are broken down and towns are broken down by zones. So we want to know, maybe census blocks or zones, however you organize your community, we want to know the zone. That helps us with mapping. That helps us with looking at small portions of our data in a larger form. So it's very helpful to have that. We want to know the officers who were assigned, Officer 1, Officer 2, right? We want to know if fire also responded. We want to know who the primary officer was, because you could have 10 officers respond to a call. So you want to know some key pieces of information. Okay. And so, sometimes this is considered the most dirty data, right? Because this is stuff, like, think about it. Your adrenaline's going, someone's on the phone, they're calling 911, you're trying to figure it out as a dispatcher, the officer's on the scene, gun is drawn. The last thing people are thinking about is data. So it is often so that this type of data could be the dirtiest, even though we try to clean it up and make it a little bit more packaged, it often tends to be the dirtiest data. So some tips about your CAD data. Again, it contains the initial information and is often later determined to be different, right? So, those shots fired and it was really a cat knocking over the garbage, or, we went out to a domestic in progress and it ended up being resulting in a murder, or we went out to a past burglary and then we ended up finding another case or something else existing there. So CAD data does not necessarily change even if the crime reason is found out not to be that. So we always say to folks, now this is important if you're a chief listening to this, this is important. You do not want to change your CAD reason, the initial call reason, okay? And I've seen some records management systems have the initial call reason and then a secondary code called the actual call reason. So why we first went out and then why we actually went out, right? And so some agencies can do it that way, but whatever you do, you do not want to change the initial purpose of why you went out there, because that really messes up your deployment strategies. Because whether or not these things are happening, someone believes they're happening, and so our officers need to be there. So we need to allot the appropriate amount of time, right? So some agencies, let's see, have duplicate calls like we talked about, me, my neighbor, and another neighbor. We all call on the same incident, right? It's all occurring, a car accident at 123 Main Street. That'll be in there 3 times, right? Because 3 different people call. So it often is that dirty data, but it is very, very helpful for a variety of reasons. So here's when to use CAD data for analysis, right? So don't delete your CAD data. It's so important. Time on calls. You want to know how much time officers spend on a call, on a motor vehicle stop, on a crash, on a burglary, on a whatever. You want to know how much time they spend on calls, right? You want to know which types of activities are officers most likely involved in. Are officers most involved in reactive, or are they most involved in proactive activity? Are they most involved in activity in the downtown area that's proactive or reactive, right? And so we can really dissect this really deeply and see what types of calls our officers are involved in. Are they violent? Are they person crimes? Are they property events? Are they disturbances? Are they big crimes like murder, rape, robbery, assault? Or are they, more quality of life crimes like disorderlies and graffitis and some things that really impact our community, but maybe not be necessarily considered big crimes, right? You're going to use your CAD data to analyze priority 1 calls. You're going to look at the locations, the times, the day of week, all of this related to your priority 1 calls. Looking at engagement activities, where is our engagement occurring? Where, relative to our crime and crash hotspots, is our engagement occurring in those locations? Or is our engagement occurring at honey holes, right? Where's our engagement occurring? We want to make sure that wherever our most up activity locations are, wherever our hotspots are, that our officers are on those, in the most effective and efficient time periods, right? We can also, measure initial responses, not necessarily actual activities. So we want to know when there are actually shots fired, but we want to also know when the community believes that there's crimes occurring, because that does help us with our deployment strategies. It helps us in training and it helps us make officers really aware of what they're facing. So when not to use CAD data to analyze your data in your community. So you're not going to use NOT. You're not going to use the counts of actual crime. You will not use CAD data to count your crime. And here's the reason, right? So you might have 50 calls for burglary, but only 20 of them were actual burglaries, right? So you're not going to use CAD data to analyze your crime counts. And stay tuned for the next video, because I'm going to show you exactly where to analyze all of that stuff. But you're not going to use that in your CAD data. You're not going to use your CAD data for that purpose. You're not going to use your CAD data to look at details of crime patterns or trends. Your CAD data is not going to give you the who, what, when, where, why of crime patterns and trends. So you're simply not going to use that for your analysis. You're not going to use CAD data for that. details of crimes, details of victims, none of that is used. You don't use CAD data for any of that stuff. Remember, CAD data is really used for your operations and really to help you understand, where your officers are going, where they should be deployed to, where resources, there might be some gaps in resources, and so forth. So CAD data is incredibly important. So if you're working for an agency right now, if you're the executive of an agency right now, and you're saying to yourself, should I, save my historical data, or hey, CAD data is not important, I'm just going to delete it, or whatever it might be. The answer is no, no, no. Your CAD data is so valuable. And yes, it's a little bit dirty, and I understand that, but there's ways that analysts can tweak it and turn it so that it's a little bit more clean to work with and to manage. But in essence, you 100% want to use your CAD data to analyze your operations. So stay tuned to the next video, because this is really part of it, right? So the CAD data is part of your data, and it analyzes some very specific things, time on calls and so forth. But your RMS data is the next level, right? This is the next level, and we're going to talk about that in the next video. Be sure to subscribe.